February 2022. The world watches in horror as Vladimir Putin's armies invade Ukraine. But this is not the first time one man's ambition has threatened peace in Europe. During the late 1930s, another authoritarian ruler set in motion the events that would lead to the outbreak of the Second World War. Adolf Hitler. Hitler's campaign began with the strangest invasion in history. On the 12th of March 1938, German tanks roll across the border into Austria. They're welcomed by smiling civilians who greet the German Führer as a hero. This is the moment when the countdown to the Second World War begins. The decisions and actions Hitler takes over the next 18 months will drag the world to war. Without him, there would be no Second World War. No Holocaust, no senseless killing of millions of people. To understand how it happened, we need to understand him. In this series, we're telling the story of these 18 months, from the 12th of March 1938 to the 3rd of September 1939, through the eyes of Hitler himself, revealing how this bully, gambler, and arch manipulator brought the world to the edge of destruction. This time, we've reached the 27th of September 1938. Hitler has successfully taken control of Austria and is now threatening to invade Czechoslovakia. Britain and France are warning that they'll step in if he goes ahead with the Czech invasion. The future of Europe hangs in the balance. It's late afternoon on Tuesday the 27th of September. Hitler is meeting with his closest advisors in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He's agitated. For months, he's been planning the next step in his grand plan, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. But he's worried that if he invades, Britain and France may declare war on Germany. And that is not his only problem.
When Hitler's in Berlin, he's looking out of the window of the Reichschancellery at some of the German troops who are heading towards the Czech border.
He notes to his dismay that they're not met with the kind of enthusiasm he'd been hoping to see from German people.
And what he's quite struck by is the sight of civilians not cheering, not applauding, but really avoiding the sight of these German troops.
It makes Hitler think that perhaps he's misjudged the mood of the German people.
It's the first sign, possibly, that he has to tread a little bit warily, and this does have an effect on him.
Hitler's so shaken, he does something surprising. He writes to the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and appears to offer an olive branch.
Chamberlain responds by organising a conference between Germany, Britain, France and Italy, and it's to be held in Munich.
Chamberlain, from his perspective, thinks, I told you, this guy is reasonable. We can talk to him, so we'll do, and we strike a deal, and all will be fine.
Chamberlain asks the fascist dictator of Italy and Hitler's ally, Benito Mussolini, to act as a mediator.
Mussolini takes quite an important role in this because he influences Hitler at this point. So he says to Hitler, it would be a good idea. It's a good idea. You better turn up.
Hitler agrees to the conference. Just 2 days later, Hitler meets Mussolini, Chamberlain, and the French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier at the Führerbau, his headquarters in Munich. The future of peace in Europe lies in their hands.
You have two very polar opposite couples at the Munich conference. You have the two fascist leaders, Mussolini and Hitler, decked in their uniforms, decorated with medals, very bombastic, very flash.
And on the other side, you have Neville Chamberlain and the leader of France, Daladier, who are much more sedate, civilian, bourgeois, well-dressed, well-meaning and polite, which is a spectacle that would be quite funny if it wasn't such a serious occasion.
It's very clear from Hitler's demeanour during the discussions that he's not particularly happy to be there. He's rather uncomfortable socially, not least because German is the only language he can speak, so he sticks quite close to Mussolini.
He allows Mussolini to do the translating for him and very much plays a back seat during this whole negotiation.
And you see Hitler starting to ape Mussolini a bit. It's very, very strange. And it just underlines that Hitler is not as experienced at this kind of thing as he likes to think he is.
Secretly, Hitler wants the whole of Czechoslovakia. But late that night, after hours of negotiation, he seems to accept a compromise. The British and French agree to transfer one Czech region, the Sudetenland, home to 3 million ethnic Germans, over to German control.
They finally do the deal at 2 o'clock in the morning, everyone signs, and you finally have the Munich Agreement.
It's decided that the German occupation of the Sudetenland will begin in 2 days' time, on the 1st of October, 1938. But Hitler isn't happy. Later that day, Chamberlain makes a personal visit to Hitler at his apartment in Munich.
Chamberlain is very happy. He's jubilant. He feels that this is a new era of peace between Germany and Britain. Hitler's very different. He's a lot quieter. He seems silent and annoyed.
Chamberlain produces this piece of paper, and that piece of paper represents a commitment by Germany and Britain never to go to war with one another again, and they both sign it.
Hitler attaches no significance whatsoever to this piece of paper. It is an entirely throwaway, cynical move.
Here you see the contrast. Chamberlain believes in the diplomacy of pieces of paper. Hitler believes in the diplomacy of armed force. He knows that this piece of paper means nothing.
The Prime Minister comes home, home to an empire filled with joy and relief, home to a welcome that he will never forget.
Back in London, Chamberlain is greeted with a hero's welcome. He holds up his signed piece of paper and declares, "It is peace for our time."
And we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
But that's not what Hitler is thinking. Three days later, Hitler enters the Sudetenland. His new subjects are jubilant. Back in Germany, he's celebrated as a saviour of peace. The Munich Agreement is a triumph.
Of course, on the surface, it's a great success for Hitler.
This is something that gave him a lot of credibility and a lot of support in Germany.
And yet, on a personal level for Hitler, he feels that he's failed. He wants the whole of Czechoslovakia, and he's not satisfied with just this region. He doesn't like having to make compromises, and he feels very uncomfortable having to make concessions.
The Munich Agreement is Hitler's idea of hell. Diplomacy is for people who want to take things slowly. Hitler didn't want to take things slowly. He wanted to march into Prague.
And he's really furious that he's been cheated out of this, not just by the British and the French, but also by the German people. He considers that they've been weak in this hour of testing.
The ink is barely dry on the Munich Agreement, and Hitler's already planning his revenge. Less than 3 weeks later, Hitler meets his army commanders at the Reich Chancellery and issues them with a top-secret new order. They're to prepare for the invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Hitler tells them he's still going to wipe Czechoslovakia from the face of the earth, and that nothing has changed. It might take him a little bit longer, but he's still going to go and invade Czechoslovakia.
This is a man who is behaving like a spoilt, erratic child.
And like a child, Hitler's not prepared to compromise. He's determined to get what he wants, whatever the cost. Hitler's in Munich at an annual Nazi dinner at the grand ballroom of the City Hall. For tonight, he's putting his anger over Czechoslovakia to the back of his mind, and he's determined to enjoy the occasion.
There's an atmosphere of celebration, the great and good of the Nazi movement together in the home, the capital, as they call it, of the Nazi movement.
They're all having a fine time drinking away. You know, it's really cause for celebration.
Hitler takes his seat next to Goebbels, his chief of propaganda.
This reflects the close relationship that the two men have.
But the celebrations are about to be disturbed.
Somebody comes over and informs Hitler that a telegram has arrived from Paris. Hitler reads it and then storms off in a huff without giving his speech, without giving any explanation.
Guests look on in surprise. What they don't know is that this is all a big act.
In fact, Hitler had heard the news from Paris earlier in the afternoon.
A German diplomat, Ernst von Rath, has been murdered at the Paris embassy by a 17-year-old Jewish teenager called Herschel Grinspan.
Hitler might be preoccupied by thoughts of Czechoslovakia, but his hatred of the Jews is never far from his mind.
Hitler sees this murder as an opportunity to strike against the Jews.
But Hitler's got a problem. He's been carefully cultivating an image as a man of peace. He can't risk being seen to instigate violence.
This is quite characteristic of how Hitler has tended to operate throughout the lifetime of the Nazi movement. He's always very keen to maintain plausible denial, if you like.
Hitler can sit back, and if it goes well, he can sort of take some credit for it, but if it goes badly, he can distance himself from it and say, oh, I had nothing to do with these outrages.
After Hitler storms out, it's up to Goebbels to deliver the evening speech.
Goebbels is one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich. He's a frustrated journalist, and he just so happens to have this absolute genius for PR. He really is the world's first malevolent spin doctor.
Goebbels stands up and he starts on this outraged speech about this murder that has occurred in Paris.
He says that any demonstrations of German public outrage that may happen over the next few hours and days should not be stopped.
The audience are left in no doubt. Goebbels has just suggested Nazi Party members across Germany should retaliate the murder of von Rath.
Phone calls are then made from this room in Munich to the Nazi organisations across the country.
Spread around Nazi stormtroopers who then organise a widespread series of attacks on the night of the 9th of November against Germany's Jewish community.
Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass, is the start of the Holocaust.
It is a night of pure violence and terror.
Synagogues are burned down across the country. Thousands of Jewish-owned shops and indeed homes have their windows smashed in. The shops are often looted.
Even the Hitler Youth get involved with this, with older boys leading younger boys in the streets and stating that the streets must run red with Jewish blood.
91 Jewish people are killed during the night of the 9th of November.
And if all that wasn't enough, 30,000 Jews are then incarcerated in concentration camps.
Hitler avoids being seen to give the instruction for the anti-Semitic violence to begin. But those who take to the streets that night have no doubt they're carrying out the Führer's wishes. They're acting on a set of ideas that Hitler's been promoting for years.
In 1919, Hitler is still in the German army after the defeat in World War I.
He's been recruited to give talks, to give speeches.
Essentially anti-Marxist lectures to soldiers before they're demobilised.
And he discovers that he has a real charisma and knack for giving speeches.
He's rather good at influencing people.
One day he's giving one of his lectures about Marxism and suddenly changes tack to talk about the Jews.
Hitler feels that there is a sort of international Jewry plot to dominate the world and stop honest, true Germans from fulfilling their destiny.
This is the first known anti-Semitic statement from Hitler. His denunciation is so strong that one of his handlers takes him to one side and tells him to tone it down. Even for sympathetic listeners, this is extreme stuff. Hitler's been soaking up the far-right politics of Munich.
There's a wide network of far-right nationalists in Munich at the time, and Hitler latches on to many of their ideas. He comes to see Germany's defeat in the First World War as the result of Jews and socialists stabbing Germany in the back.
He buys into this myth that the German armed forces had never been defeated in the battlefield, but the defeat had instead come on the home front thanks to Jewish subversives fomenting revolution at home.
Hitler comes to see the Jews as the scapegoat for all Germany's problems, and believes they must be forced out of the country. His speech in 1919 might be the first time he publicly speaks out against the Jews, but it's not the last. Anti-Semitism shapes Hitler's ideas right through to that terrible night in November 1938. The morning after Kristallnacht, Hitler knows he needs to distance himself from the violence. His deputies claim the attacks were simply the result of ordinary Germans angry at the Jews. But very few people believe this.
German people, by and large, are not very positive about the events of Kristallnacht. This is not necessarily because they care about the Jews, but because they disapprove of the widespread destruction of property and looting that takes place. They see that as unbefitting of a civilized nation like Germany.
Although not all Germans are anti-Semitic, many feel now that the Jews do not have a place within German society.
Outside Germany, much of the world reacts in shock and outrage. Kristallnacht exposes the violent anti-Semitism that lies at the heart of Hitler's Nazi regime.
It's clear to the outside world that this government is determined to end Jewish life in Germany.
The world now is beginning to see the true nature of the Nazi regime. Hitler's mask is beginning to slip.
Hitler's been revealed as a racist thug, and his mask is about to slip even further. It's Thursday the 10th of November, 1938, and Hitler's in Berlin. He's about to give an extraordinary and top-secret address to selected members of the German press.
Hitler admits to them that although he's been playing the role of peacemaker for many years, that's not that accurate. He's not really a man of peace at all.
He says, now I am going to reveal a different side of my personality, and I want you, the press, to emphasize that I have become uncompromising. I am now the uncompromising Hitler.
Now is the time to start to recalibrate the German people in readiness for war.
He says, I want you, to the German press, to push that idea forward to the German people that you're not going to get an omelette without breaking eggs. You've got to get this through armed force.
German people have to learn that the realities of power politics will sometimes demand force of arms, that at some point there is going to be a great trial of strength. This is preparing the German people for the war which he has been planning for a long time.
As he encourages the press to prepare Germany for war, Hitler continues to plot the next stage of his plan. He's determined to get his hands on Czechoslovakia's natural riches.
Czechoslovakia is rich with natural resources as well as the world's largest single armaments factories, the vast Skoda works.
But Czechoslovakia represents something even bigger for Hitler.
It's about more expansion. It's about making the German Reich greater. It's about achieving living space, Lebensraum for the Germans.
He believes that Germans, as the Aryan race, as the strongest people in the world, deserve to have more room to live in. And that room, that space that he has in mind, lies in Eastern Europe.
He needs resources for the German people. He needs land for the German people.
And Hitler gets his inspiration from the unlikeliest of places.
Hitler grew up reading the famous German novelist Karl May, whose adventure stories were based in the American West.
Hitler sees Lebensraum in Eastern Europe as very much a similar project to the American conquest of the western territories of the United States.
He viewed the United States of America, certainly white America, as an extension of that Anglo-Saxon or German hierarchy.
He's seen the fact that they've moved from the coast all the way into the interior. They've subjugated or effectively wiped out the Native Americans, taken their land, and prospered as a result of it.
If America looked to the west for expansion, Hitler's looking in the opposite direction, Czechoslovakia is firmly in his sights, but he's also eyeing up much of Central and Eastern Europe, and ultimately the vast expanse of the Soviet Union.
In the east of the Soviet Union, even in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, up in the Baltic states, there's a lot more of these natural resources, and he wants to get his hands on them.
There's no doubt that he's utterly ruthless in the way he's planning to deal with the peoples who are in this land that he's going to be taking over. Some will be deported to Siberia, some will be exterminated, and some will be enslaved, and in their place, he will populate those lands with good ethnic Germans.
At the end of 1938, Hitler knows he has to be very careful about how he achieves these ambitions.
He is concerned quite how far he can push that idea of the nation wanting to expand without getting into serious amount of trouble. So how will that be responded to by the Western powers?
But he cannot believe that Britain and France will go to war. Why should they care? That's his logic, because that's what he wants to hear.
Hitler's still careful to keep up the pretense of being a man of peace on the world stage. On the 30th of January 1939, he gives his annual address to the members of the German parliament, the Reichstag, at the Kroll Opera House.
He says that Germany has got no future plans for territorial conquest. This is an obvious lie because he's planning it at the time.
Then Hitler goes on to say something extraordinary, that if there is a war, it won't be him who causes it.
It'll be caused by the Jews and Jews agitating for war, and that any violence to come can squarely be laid at their door.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
This speech marks a crucial shift in Hitler's public declarations.
For the first time, he's actually really vocally talking in terms of war and the Jews in the same breath.
In this speech, Hitler pins the blame for any future war on the Jews, and ominously predicts it will lead to their annihilation in Europe. "11 days later, Hitler returns to the Kroll Opera House. This time he's meeting secretly with his army commanders. He's got something important to tell them. He lays out his plans for conquest of Czechoslovakia and beyond.
He gives notice to his most senior military commanders that a war is going to come, and it will not be an ordinary war, that this is a war of different ideologies and different races.
He's absolutely determined here. He won't shrink back from his view or from his ambitions.
Hitler is set on a war of expansion in the East, and the rest of Czechoslovakia will be his next act. But he wants to protect his image as a man of peace, so he needs to find an excuse to start the invasion. A month later, something happens that plays straight into Hitler's hands.
At this point, there's a great deal of disunity in the Czechoslovak state. There's an increasing divide opening up between the Czechs and the Slovaks. The Slovak leader is Father Joseph Tiso. He's a Catholic priest, and he's very much in favor of Slovak independence.
Joseph Tiso demands of the Czechoslovak government Slovakia's independence.
Dr. Emil Hacha is the Czech president, and he decides to react with force to dismiss these attempts of autonomy. He puts Tiso in prison. He really wants to play the tough guy. But Hacha is making a mistake here.
This plays into Hitler's hands because he's able to present the Czechoslovak state as essentially ungovernable, as breaking down in the face of the national aspirations of its people.
I mean, this is just exactly what Hitler wants. He wants to stir it all up, have them all at loggerheads with one another, and then he can just go boom, straight through the middle.
At noon the next day, Hitler's in his newly completed HQ, the new Reich Chancellery.
The new Reich Chancellery is absolutely magnificent. It's enormous, and it just says power, control, authority, all in one massive edifice.
This was supposed to be at the very heart of what would be the new Germany, the new German Reich. It was a place Europe would be ruled from.
Hitler's here for a crucial meeting with Goebbels, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Wilhelm Keitel.
Von Ribbentrop is foreign minister. He's an ex-businessman. He's slavishly loyal to Hitler, and for that reason, a lot of the other top Nazis despise him. They see him as a bit of a snake.
Wilhelm Keitel is the chief of the armed forces, and he's Hitler's ultimate yes man. He's completely devoted to Hitler.
Hitler reveals to von Ribbentrop and to Keitel that he is going to use this political crisis in the Czechoslovak state to act, and he's going to act very fast.
He tells them to set the date of the 15th of March, so just 5 days away, for the invasion.
Goebbels talks about Hitler crowing with delight at this, and the reason he's crowing is because finally he can get his military invasion.
Hitler loves the risk and thrill of a gamble, and is about to play his hand once again. But first, he wants to make sure the odds are loaded in his favor. He needs to secure his excuse for invasion. Three days later, the newly released Slovak leader, Joseph Tiso, visits Hitler in Berlin. Hitler intends to use Tiso as his match to ignite the tinderbox that is Czechoslovakia.
Tiso and Hitler, they're different characters, but they share some common ground in their political beliefs. Tiso, his main goal, achieving Slovakian independence, is worth collaborating with Hitler.
What he's trying to do with Tiso is to tell him, you need to press now your claims for the independence of Slovakia, and I'll back you up.
He's basically offering a carrot to Tiso and say, you know, I can help you achieve your goals, and you help me achieve my goals.
Tiso follows Hitler's instructions, and the next day, Slovak independence is declared.
Hitler has manipulated the situation in Czechoslovakia to his advantage. And he's about to make the most of it. Hitler's in the new Reich Chancellery. His troops are poised to cross into Czechoslovakia. All they need is his order. But before Hitler can start his invasion, he has an unexpected visitor. In a final attempt to save his country, the Czech president, Dr. Emil Hacha, travels to Berlin to plead with Hitler to call off the invasion.
He's 66 years of age, he's got a heart condition, and he makes a blunder, really, that plays into Hitler's hands.
Which is to go to Hitler, to meet the wolf in the wolf's lair.
Hacha is in a difficult situation, but also personally a frail, older man.
Hitler, he knows exactly what to do once Hacha is there.
Hitler has a talent for sensing other people's weaknesses and exploiting them. This is a skill he's been fine-tuning over a lifetime. Ten-year-old Adolf Hitler hates his father.
Hitler's father, Alois, was quite violent, really. He would beat them up, Adolf and his brother, if they stepped out of line.
What Hitler learns from this, from his father, is it's all right to be a bully, and actually you can get your way by bullying too.
Hitler doesn't seem to treat his sister terribly well.
In her diary written when she was younger, Paula talks about Hitler being very much a bully.
At the same time, Hitler is smothered with love and affection by his mother, Clara Hitler.
She is very nurturing, very kind. She smothers Hitler with love and affection, and Hitler becomes very spoilt because of this.
Hitler continues these kinds of personality traits into adulthood. He becomes used to being able to throw tantrums to get his way and to bullying people who are weaker than him.
That young bully is now the most feared man in Europe. In the early hours of the 14th of March, Czech President Hacha is about to endure a masterclass in intimidation. Hitler makes Hacha wait for hours in the Adlon Hotel, while he and his entourage enjoy a film at the new Reich Chancellery, a new romantic comedy fittingly called A Hopeless Case.
Sie haben ja Fieber. Einfach wegzulaufen.
Only once the credits have rolled, at 1:15 a.m., is Hacha finally summoned by Hitler.
This is all part of Hitler's strategy to wear Hacha down and to exploit his tiredness and weakness.
Hacha comes in, thinking he's just going to have a nice, pleasant negotiation with Hitler. And the room is lit by lamplight, so it's in that nice gangster tradition of subdued light, which gangsters enjoy, intimidating people in subdued light, and Hitler was an expert at this.
By this point, Hitler's got Hacha exactly where he wants him. He's in Berlin. It's kind of, he hasn't quite got the kind of spotlight straight on his face and bound his arms behind a chair, but it's kind of not far from it.
Hacha comes in, he said, I've always wanted to meet you. I've always admired you and the way you've made Germany a great country. And so Hitler lets him finish this little fawning speech, gets to the end of it. Hitler looks him in the eyes, and then he says, Czechoslovakia has let me down. He said, you have let me down. He said, your people have let me down.
Hitler basically puts a pistol on his chest and says, look, these are our demands, and if you don't comply with them, we basically start attacking you.
Hitler tells Hacha that the Germans will invade at 6 a.m. that same morning, and he must tell his forces to stand down.
Hitler then gives the floor to Hermann Goering.
Hermann Goering is Hitler's number two, effectively. He is second most powerful person in Nazi Germany. He's the head of the Luftwaffe.
Goering raises the ante by saying to him, well, Hacha, sign this, or we'll bomb Prague tomorrow morning.
And it's too much for Hacha at one stage. He collapses.
Goering looks around and, oh God, he's fell on the floor.
What happens if he dies now? The whole world is going to think that we murdered the Czechoslovak president in the Reich Chancellery.
And he goes into the corridor and he shouts, get Dr. Morell. Because Dr. Morell is Hitler's famous doctor. Dr. Morell then gives him an injection, possibly amphetamines. It's stopped him having the heart attack.
By 4 a.m., Hacha has recovered just enough to hold a pen. He signs Czechoslovakia over to Hitler.
Hitler's reaction is jubilant. He orders his two secretaries to give him a kiss on the cheek, and he says, this is the greatest day of my life. I will go down in history as the greatest ever German.
He's happy to bully, to manipulate other politicians to get what he wants.
Let's be under no illusions about this. This is straightforward gangster tactics. This is blackmail on an extraordinary scale with real brutal militarism behind it.
Just 2 hours after Hacha signs over Czechoslovakia, German troops cross the border. They travel through the Czech countryside in freezing weather. Facing no resistance, they're in the capital, Prague, within 3 hours.
As the German troops arrive in Prague, the reception is very different from a year earlier in Austria.
There are no cheering people anymore. There are just sullen faces.
This is a country that has been absolutely beaten and has been taken over against its will.
At around noon, Hitler follows his troops into Czechoslovakia on his heavily armoured train. He then travels the last 60 miles into Prague in his open-topped Mercedes limousine. That night, he sleeps in Prague's Hradčany Castle, the ancient residence of the kings of Bohemia.
That's like spending the night in the White House or kicking out the Queen and moving into Buckingham Palace. It's very symbolic, and he spends the night there, and it is saying, I am now your master, I am now your king. Bow to me.
Hitler's triumphant. He's got exactly what he wants, without having to fire a shot.
It's still a calculated gamble by Hitler, but he's pulled it off again because the response of the British and French is to literally do nothing.
Once again, as Hitler has predicted, the Western powers have stood aside.
This invasion of Czechoslovakia is a brutal wake-up call for the West.
Here before our eyes unfolds the drama of a nation dying. At Munich, the Führer gave his word that he wanted no more land in Europe. These pictures show you what his word is worth.
The reaction in Britain and France is one of absolute horror.
He's ripped up the Munich Agreement and showed his true colours.
Hitler cannot be trusted. He's lied and lied and lied. We were duped last time around. We will never be duped again.
Kristallnacht exposes Hitler as a racist bully, while the invasion of Czechoslovakia shows him to be a warmonger.
He is now included within the German Reich. 7 million people, many of whom have no connections ethnically, culturally, linguistically with Germany. So the world can see that the gloves are off.
This is military conquest of foreign lands. Hitler has torn up the diplomatic rulebook he was only ever pretending to play by. Two days after Hitler takes Czechoslovakia, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, gives a speech in his home city of Birmingham.
Neville Chamberlain abandons his policy of appeasement.
He says that Britain will no longer tolerate Hitler's attempts at expansion.
But Hitler believes Chamberlain's words to be nothing more than an empty threat.
Hitler remains convinced that the talk that's coming from Britain and France at this period won't be matched with action. They won't actually challenge him.
Hitler's stared down Britain and France and won his game of brinkmanship. All his high-risk maneuvers have paid off, and he has no intention of stopping. Next time, the world holds its breath as Hitler makes his riskiest move yet.
Nothing is going to stop him. He's going to roll the dice because this is his destiny.
And inches the world closer to war.